Imagine, demand, and build a world transformed.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Today, we are having a discussion about institutional racism and the media. Today, I am joined by my co-host of Low Society podcast, Peter Coffin, and Dr. Clive Nwonka, who is he's a researcher on institutionalized racism in the media. He also has a book coming out as well. Peter and I are members of the podcast Low Society, and we both make content on YouTube. And I also have a background working in the media in England here as well. So I definitely have a few hot takes about this subject as well. Thank you for coming. Would you like to? Does anyone have any opening remarks about the subject? Dr. Clive, would you like to open?
Sure. So I've been thinking deeply about the events of this summer in Minnesota, George Floyd, and the aftermath of those events in popular culture. And one thing I noticed quite quickly was the admission of the recognition of structural racism within a number of media outlets, which was one of the more both surprising but expected outcomes of that event. And for someone who studies film, the media, and media institutions, there was something that I've been trying to unpick and explore since that moment, which is our contemporary understanding of what structural racism is, how it's manifest in the media, and this admission that we saw in the immediate aftermath. And I've coming to the understanding that our ideas of structural racism, and when I say us, I mean those on the receiving end of structural racism, and the understanding of structural racism by mainstream media institutions are very, very different meanings, and also different intentions and manifestations. And that is what I've been trying to explore in my research and conversations with colleagues, and hopefully this evening, is the ways I think we should be critiquing the immediate reaction to this phenomenon called structural racism that we're seeing amongst a number of cultural and media institutions, and what the implications are for the battle against racism.
Thank you for those opening remarks. I definitely agree. I definitely saw the conversation kind of get a shot of adrenaline after the George Floyd incident occurred. But I was also quite disturbed by some of the ways the media reacted to the kind of calls for accountability in that regard. It kind of struck me that quite a few kind of entities were using haphazard solutions in order to kind of deflect from, the real kind of concerns that people had about structural racism in these institutions, either by kind of haphazardly pushing out representation as kind of a cover for deeper institutional problems, or by kind of making nods to Black Lives Matter or nods to social justice in a very kind of cynical fashion. And also, there was this kind of, I know that, Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, came out a few months, during that whole period as well. And it kind of made the argument that structural racism is about bad people in positions of power, when it's actually about, it's about institutional and historic forces that enact a limiting program on minorities. It has very little to do with the morality, quote unquote, of individuals. It's kind of a system that perpetuates itself. And that's these are kind of the concerns that I've had around, especially around the discourse and how the media has reacted in this kind of weird haphazard way that oftentimes doesn't have very much in terms of addressing the deeper systemic issues. Peter?
I more or less just would second all of that. It's basically the same thing I would say.
What do you think, Dr. Clive?
I think I'm interested in your definition of structural racism and how you feel in certain quarters it represents a kind of system that's inbuilt within institutions of racism. Because one of the shifts I'm seeing in my research and my thinking is thinking around the idea of structural racism as being described by the media, at least anyway, as this kind of atmospheric racism. And what I mean by the atmospheric racism is it's being described to me in what I've seen as a racism that is born by a pack mentality within institutional cultural spaces, be them in schools or our legal systems or our cultural institutions, where there is an atmosphere of racism that takes place when people come together in certain areas or certain institutions or public spaces or private spaces even. And all we need to do is dismantle that structure and that pack mentality and that atmosphere, and racism is resolved. For me, there was a slight problem there. And the problem is it seems to de-individualize racism. So we can no longer pinpoint a particular person who is guilty of racial harassment or racial discrimination. And that is the atmospheric quality. There is no accountability for an individual who is guilty of harassing someone in HR or denying someone opportunities. And in many ways, it's very, very predictable, because thinking about Stuart Hall, the Jamaican cultural theorist, and his idea of incorporation, and he's thinking about hegemonic power and its ability to incorporate and suppress the oppositional force and make it work to its own agendas. And when we're seeing cultural institutions, media institutions, who have been guilty of a long legacy of racism, now begin to use the language of the oppressed for structural racism, we instinctively understand that there will be some modifications to how they understand the language we're using. And the idea of structural racism, I think, is a way of de-individualizing their complicity and culpability to racism within institutional space. So I think it's a slightly different take on the way you see things, Angie, but I think there is also some unifications in there. But I am seeing this cynicism in when inherently racist institutions are now using the language of the challenge to racism and what the implications could be as well.
You, in some respects, even have a bit of a commodification of the sort of aesthetic of anti-racism going on. We see, I mean, you mentioned White Fragility, Angie. That was a very popular book. It did very well. It discusses a systemic racism, but I don't know that it really actually gets down into a nitty gritty of what it even means by systemic. I read it twice, actually, and I wasn't really particularly impressed by it. We've talked about it on our podcast more than a few times at this point, but I guess my question, I had a question in there. I'm thinking, what is, in your opinion, as somebody researching this, what is your opinion on where the actual impetus of sort of how do we tackle this? Who is actually accountable? And what would be an important, at least preliminary manner of addressing what we're getting at here? I
mean, that's such a difficult question to ask.
I know. I apologize for it being a far-reaching question, but
it's
really, in my mind, that was like super important.
It is, and it becomes harder and harder to do the things that you're suggesting in that question, which uncover and identify the individuals in institutional and cultural spaces within the media who are guilty of that racism. And often we need to put our faith, as unreliable as it may be, is the law. And the reason why I think the law becomes very, very important is because I'm really in agreement with what Angie mentioned about some of the methodologies that she saw in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd, which was the idea of representation. We need more representation in particular outlets in the media to remedy what we saw on that day. Now, what happened to George Floyd wasn't a lack of diversity. What happened to George Floyd was racism that actually resulted in the loss of his life. Now, there's something very, very interesting, but also very, very lamentable in the idea that a man is killed for being black, and our instant response, what I call our rapid response, and very, very classic response, is demanding better or more representation in Hollywood, in the media, in people who read our news in the evening or write our stories in newspapers. Now, those things are very, very important. I've researched for 10 years about these things. My point is, those things are not instinctively connected to what happened to George Floyd. George Floyd was a failure of the law. There is something inscribed in that police force that made them think what they were doing was lawful, and they'll be protected in some way by the law in their actions. So I was equally disappointed we didn't put our faith and our attention in legal reform, both in the US and in the UK. But equally, I could completely understand why this is much more broader than what happened at that moment, but also a long legacy and history and culture and presence of racism in all its forms: individual, institutional, cultural, systemic. But I think the balance of attention in terms of the response was immediately into thinking about the politics of representation. And I'm not quite sure that should have been the immediate response at the time. I don't want to labor the answer, but I use the term rapid response in it. And I think what I'm seeing is what I term cultural compensation. Cultural compensation, the methods that power uses often to remedy and respond to demands and uprisings against structural racism, however defined, through culture. So we saw very much in the UK, but maybe in the US as well, the immediate sharing of Black literature on social media. Read your Bell Hooks, read your Angie Davis, read those classic texts that talk about racism. Now, those things are really important, but Black culture is always in the mainstream a temporary experience. The mainstream is often only interested in Black culture, in its value, in its promotion, in its recognition, in its highlighting as the aftermath of moments of racial disquiet, which means it's very, very temporary. It often doesn't last their attention, which means we cannot put our faith in cultural conversations to be the long-term solution to much, much bigger problems.
I wanted to say quickly, just before I continue on the point, I've been asked to shout out the worldtransform.org. If you want to see more content, go there. If you want to donate as well, there are also possibilities for you to do that there as well. And we also urge you to be civil in the comments as well. That's just some housekeeping that I've been asked to do. But back to the point. The part of the reason why I brought up the idea that, you know, institutional racism isn't necessarily tied to the morality of individuals is because it's also because of my own personal experience. I worked as a literary agent's assistant for many years before I started doing YouTube and podcasts, and I was damned from the beginning in that regard because of certain backgrounds that one is expected to have to thrive in those types of industries. The types of people who tend to work in those industries and thrive in those industries tend to come from certain Black backgrounds. There are certain social mores in those industries as well. that are as a result of those backgrounds and the types of universities and the types of educational access and all of these different factors play a role as a way of gatekeeping people of color out of the process. But it also kind of works around class lines as well, because I was not from the same class background as the people who I was working with. I was definitely not from the same class background as the people who I was working for either. And these mechanisms often, they affect obviously Black and minority people more, because we make up a disproportionate amount of the poor and of the working class. And those barriers aren't necessarily there because of the morality of individuals. They're historic forces that have kept gate-kept people of color from being able to gain prominence in certain positions. So I think it's somewhat problematic to lay the blame at the feet of individuals all the time. I mean, of course, there are going to be individual cases of bigotry, but the majority of what I suffered while working in these fields wasn't people being outwardly awful towards me. I was dealing with kind of historic forces, social mores, class expectations, things that I hadn't gained access to that then became an inhibiting factors for me in those kinds of environments. And it's as if the racism kind of does itself in that regard. It's already kind of this pre-built mechanism. And even though a lot of the people who I worked with and for were very quote unquote well-meaning white liberals who, read the Angela Davis and, were tweeting woke things every day on Twitter and tried their best and were trying to be really good allies, there was still these institutional barriers in front of me. And a lot of it had to do with these kind of social and societal forces that already acted as a gatekeeper between me and being able to sort of thrive within these institutions. I think that institutionalized racism is something that it's been perverted in the current discourse, because a lot of people think that it's about bad people, quote unquote, in positions of power. And if we just replace those bad people with quote unquote good people, then things will be better. But there's an overall issue with the way things are structured as in the media to begin with. And these forces that I'm talking about also have a lot to do with certain access that Black people are denied in society as a whole, in general, that then kind of act as inhibitors for us to thrive in certain environments. And I guess, that's been my experience with institutionalized racism and the way that it functions.
I don't have anything to add to that. That was very, very specific to your experience. But so from my perspective I had mentioned the sort of commodification a little bit of anti-racism as an aesthetic and as an affect. That's kind of, for me, you mentioned the sort of perversion of the discussion in the mainstream media. And for me, that's kind of where we start to see how that happens. My opinion there is specifically that we sort of, in order to defang what is ultimately a very popular sentiment, which is that the police shouldn't be killing unarmed Black people, we sort of turn it into a consumable. We sort of turn it into a thing that we can, imbue and sort of like purify ourselves, or at least feel as though we're taking an action that we're watching all of the right content on this, we're reading all of the right articles. And I think this is in line with what you were saying, Clive. I think that we've really I think that the primary area where all of we're thinking overlaps is probably in the media. The media is handling this because it really wasn't like, hey, so here's the thing like this, as far as structurally, we could elucidate how police are structurally racist, how there are incentives that are in front of these people to, disregard, certain, I mean, really it's against the law to kill somebody, but just certain social mores, actual laws, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, that's kind of where I've kept my focus on.
I mean,
I was just going to say that. I also think that part of the conversation that's obfuscated is the material empowerment of people of color. I just moved to a new place, but I used to live in a kind of shared accommodation with a bunch of people who worked in the media industry as well. And I was listening to a Zoom call that one of my roommates was on, and they work in a very sort of creative field. And it was during the George Floyd incident. It was about a week or so after it occurred. And, they were all on this Zoom call that was mandatory by their company, where they were expressing Black Lives Matter sentiments and talking about how their company needed to do better, even though the majority of the people who work at their company are white, and there were no real specifics about how they were going to, or no real explorations of the issue of why there was no sort of diverse presence within their company. It was more just empty platitudes about Black Lives Mattering and about, the horribles of racism. And obviously it's coming from a place of human concern, but there was no real material exploration done to kind of look at why there is this kind of disparity in terms of Black kids usually being able to enter these industries post-graduation. And, a lot of it has to do with, the fact that the conversation around material empowerment for Black people, whether that be access to education or programs or resources, is often obfuscated by the representation question. That's kind of what power uses to obfuscate the need for material intervention a lot of the time. I remember I got my literary agency job through a program that was specifically meant to help BME, that's BAME, which is like the term in the UK that we use, BAME graduates to get into media industries. And, it was defunded by the Tory government and it no longer exists in as much of a meaningful capacity as it used to. There are all kinds of material roadblocks for why Black people are underrepresented in the media. And I feel like that gets obfuscated through these sort of symbolic gestures quite frequently.
I mean, that is one thing I'm in agreement with you on holistically. And that speaks to the often conflating of questions of anti-racism with questions of diversity. And there is a huge body of research and thinking out there about the ways in which dominant power often uses this idea of diversity as this kind of demonstration of wokeness and progressiveness and responsiveness to anti-racist questions. Obviously, we both know just today, the Academy have now announced their diversity standards based on the UK model, which I've critiqued, to respond to what is widely known as structural and systemic racism in Hollywood. And we have to wait and see what the results from that will be. But that's a classic example of the solution by diversity to the problem, which is racism. Now, you mentioned, Peter, the idea of the quantification of anti-racism, which is something that was overt across those first few weeks in the aftermath of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. And if we think about the media as inherently neoliberal institutions, the one thing we know about neoliberalism, it has this very, very sophisticated way of incorporating difference within the limits of power. And this, to your point, Angie, about your class background being a crucial and driving factor alongside your race as well in your exclusion from industry and from institutions. And even in that moment of cultural compensation, where we're seeing this rush and this rapid response to represent racial difference in previously kind of white and pristine institutions, history tells us, data tells us, that often it is those with the most cultural capital who will succeed and ascend in these institutions. And sometimes, very frequently, those are interracial questions as well. You know, the growing and mobile Black and ethnic minority middle class, who often ascend by virtue of their class background in these particular institutions, which is very, very acceptable to particular neoliberal media institutions as well. And this often creates a kind of cultural spaces that you've experienced, I've experienced as well. So I think
it's kind of, I just want to
so hold on, Angie. I think the commodification of anti-racism is probably one of the biggest challenges that we on the left are facing now, and how we try to push back from the neoliberalization of anti-racism. That is, for me, the area of concern. Sorry, Angie, go ahead.
Part of that is because, I think part of that is because the conversation around racial progress often creates cross-class subjects, which is an issue, of course. And I mean, we are all neoliberal subjects, which is also why I'm kind of skeptical of the idea of a Black community that exists. I mean, you know, in the past, there was definitely a Black community, but now we are all atomized neoliberal subjects. And what the Black community has become sort of a neoliberal category where it's like, I have something in common with Oprah Winfrey because we're Black, even though we don't have anything in common because we're not from the same class background at all. And that's kind of why I'm skeptical of how these conversations about anti-racism within the media often create this cross-class confusion. And I think that a lot of it has to do with just material empowerment and access. Those issues are usually the things that act as barriers for people of color being able to find empowerment on their own terms. Empowerment that isn't just like a gilded cage of, oh, here, you will be the perfect kind of neoliberal subject representation of your demographic. However, you have to do that on our terms. I think that it kind of reminds me of you know, the 1990s when Britpop was like a huge thing, and part of the reason why there was this huge boom in music and culture was because there were grants that were being given out from the government to, you know, the young entrepreneur. I forget what it was. It was like some weird like leftover from the Thatcher era thing, but you saw a lot of young musicians and comedians and, you know, taking advantage of that like little tiny bit of material access that they had that then enabled them to, you know, do things like have a band or do things like spend time making music or spend time, you know, pursuing creativity in that regard. And, you know, there was a big cultural kind of boom from that where you had music coming from, you know, members of the working class, members of a class that oftentimes doesn't have the time to, you know, you have that kind of access. Am I frozen? We're having technical difficulties. If the mods can hear me, yeah, maybe like delete me and then add me back. That. Uh-oh, I'm still frozen. Hang on. If you guys maybe try again, deleting me and adding me back to continue while I figure out my issue.
So, Clive, anything to add to that?
I mean, I'm in agreement with that, and just thinking a bit more specifically around structural racism in the aftermath of George Floyd, and this recognition I think one of the key things that I'm observing, which kind of ties with your point around the quantification of anti-racism, is the use of language. And I kind of mentioned this already in regards to the use of structural racism, what it means to different people by institutions. But certainly in the UK context, we saw in that rapid response, institutions such as Channel 4, the BBC, by others, saying we are an inherently anti-racist organization.
Yeah.
Now, I don't remember any moment prior to this summer where you've heard any public institution use the word racism or anti-racism within their practices. So
particularly anti-racism. If there's some racial concern, I've always noticed they've attempted to stay in the area of diversity, because generally a diversity concern rather than a racism concern or racial concern. So I would say I definitely agree with that.
Or underrepresentation. Or, which is a very, very euphemistic way of talking about obviously kind of the same thing, because what that does is seem to suggest to us that what happens in institutional space is simply, again, this atmospheric, haphazard arising of the exclusion of particular people along the lines of race or class or gender or others as well. And that it denies the reality that these things are brought into being. Okay, racism is performed, and the representation is performed by decision making, by individuals, by pack mentalities. So that shift, dramatic shift in language from diversity, representation, underrepresentation, sorry, to structuralism and anti-racism, I think is the key shift that we saw in that period of time.
Absolutely.
The implications of that for me are, I'm not convinced by the ability of mainstream media organizations to unthink and rethink that history and legacy of racism within the period of days in the aftermath of George Floyd. Because in the UK, we haven't yet devised institutionally a language and practice of anti-racism that is described in legislation. What we have, as you'll know, is a language of diversity and inclusion. We haven't got that instinctive practice of what anti-racism looks like. So what we then descend into instinctively is our native indigenous practice, which is more diverse, as Angie mentioned, greater representation in particular fields, the visage and surface level image of racial and cultural and gender difference. That is the key shift that I'm identifying here, which really maps onto your point around the quantification of anti-racism, which is also, in my understanding, the false recognition of racism without doing the deep, deep analysis, what that means, how it manifests. What is this impact on those living on the cutting edge of structural racism? That takes a generation. That isn't a reckoning or awakening that takes place within a matter of days. So that's why we need to retain a skepticism and cynicism in these months afterwards, until we're really convinced that those institutions and organizations have done that deep thinking to really understand what structural racism means and how it impacts those living on the cutting edge of it as well.
For sure. Like, obviously, just adding, you know, a fist into your avatar on Twitter for your brand account it's of course not anti-racism, but that's, I mean, that's been the extent of what a lot of these public facing entities have done. And I do want to ask a little bit more about your point on the idea that it's performed on you know, the basis that I do agree with you. Like, racism is absolutely something that is performed. It's an action that requires participation and
frozen again. Sorry, I don't know why it keeps happening.
It does require that participation, but I wonder what your opinion on like the incentivization of it sort of is, like how, structurally, when we're talking about, why racism arose, like the current form of racism, what we characterize as racism is sort of a descendant of race science, which was sort of an ideological, obviously not real science, it's a pseudoscience, justification for slavery in the United States and ultimately, in other places in the world as well. And I think that a lot of what we deal with, as far as where these things are coming from institutionally, are I think that it is sort of a descendant of the need to justify some form of exploitation. Obviously, we're talking slavery, we're talking people after the slaves were free. We're also talking about the fact that people don't have the or it's not necessarily institutional, but they don't necessarily have the resources to enact any form of class mobility because they're coming from literally nothing. They were slaves, they were freed, and oh my God, why can't they achieve the American dream? I think to some extent, there is a sort of like incentivization that keeps people performing these things, and I'd be curious to ask what you think of that. Or exactly like what kinds of, where that, like, more or less, not just like simply like what do you think the incentive is, but kind of how that role plays in this.
So when we say the incentivization of racism within institutional cultural space, to think about the media, I mean, I can't help thinking about Cedric Robinson and his kind of classic critique of racial capitalism. The kind of different manifestations of that we're kind of grappling with now. And in many ways, Angie's kind of spoken to some of them in the ability of neoliberalism to stratify racism on class lines. In terms of I think for me, thinking about the media, what incentivizes racism is its denial in a very, very paradoxical way. The absence of analysis or recognition of racism, the kind of hermeneutic injustice that Black and brown people experience within institutions, is often, I think, the incentive for the continuation of racism within institutional cultures, be that on-screen stereotypes of Black and brown people, the absence of Black and brown people in kind of key decision-making roles within how the media is constructed, the kind of structural racisms that Angie and other people have been describing in the last kind of few months in the aftermath of George Floyd. I think absence often is the incentive, the absence of discussion, the absence of recognition. And what we've seen now in the last kind of 2-3 months is I want to be convinced that media institutions have now recognized the modes and forms in which they have denigrated and destroyed and discriminated against Black and brown people. But it's always in a fine balance with the need to deny,
right,
in order to maintain a kind of status quo, where Blackness, brownness is always the negated identity within these spaces. So I'm not quite sure if I answered your question directly, but I think for me, the lack of willingness to acknowledge and identify is another way of sustaining the kind of racism we're seeing.
I would argue that these institutions are not incentivized to do this sort of examination. I mean, if we're going to talk about racism as a general concept, it's a justifying ideology, one that's been created in order to kind of create an underclass of people to exploit. I mean, that was the original reason for the conception of racism in the first place. Was, it wasn't just for the creation of white supremacy. It was in order to extract labor for things like sugar, cotton, and all of the other things that, were part of the economic extraction of chattel slavery. And the racism that still persists in our society acts upon this justifying ideology in order to sort of continue to perpetuate the class division between specific people and the ruling hegemonic kind of elite in that regard. And I don't think that these institutions are incentivized to do this kind of examination that you're talking about. They're incentivized, especially because they're neoliberal institutions, they're incentivized to maintain a status quo, one that suits their aims, and one that continues to perpetuate these mores. And that's why I mentioned the concept of cross-class subjects, because through representation, that's what occurs. They create cross-class subjects, people that, the larger poor and working class Black community are supposed to quote unquote identify with because of this amorphous category of race, when there's obvious class contradictions beneath that form of affiliation. And I mean, the media, the things that the media perpetuates, these hegemonic ideologies about race, whether it be essentialism or, the idea of putting out bad images or exclusion even, all kind of work to continue to perpetuate the standards that have been used to oppress people of color in society, which is part of the reason why I feel like there just isn't a real incentive for these institutions to really examine what the issues are. And I mean, obviously there's quite a lot of pressure for them to sort of show that they are, but I don't think that there is any real incentive for them to really dig down deep into the structural issues, when it's so easy for them to make these kind of tepid, symbolic nods to the issue and kind of have the problem go away. I mean, there's an entire diversity industry that exists. I mean, Robin DiAngelo, the writer of White Fragility, makes millions of dollars from, going to do diversity talks at, these different companies, getting paid hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars for, her sharing her opinions on anti-racism, so the company can then have this symbolic kind of like, look, we did the anti-racism thing, like, we're not the bad guys, like we paid someone $10,000 to come give a talk about diversity. There's an entire industry around this sort of thing. I mean, even within Hollywood, the diversity writer and all of these different forms of things that have kind of, it's kind of a way of the professional managerial class managing the problem of racism, of institutional racism in that regard. Kind of finding these managerial strategies to deal with like these very deep systemic problems that don't just end with the media, but are issues in our society as a whole and have a lot to do with the material disempowerment of people of color. So I feel like if we want to really get to the bones of this issue, we have to kind of, not allow these distractions to obfuscate conversations about real things that are going to make a difference in the lives of poor and working class people of color, real things that are going to be able to give us access in that regard, decent education programs, the ability to kind of have access to the knowledge and information of technologies that allow you to thrive in certain industries as well, because that's another thing that's kind of gatekept. There are plenty of material things that these companies would be doing if they actually cared about trying to kind of create diversity that isn't just sort of this sort of tepid nod to the issue. Have I killed the conversation?
I'm thinking personally.
I mean, like I remember, like I was listening in on the Zoom call, and the person, my flatmate, they work in like the audio field, and the company was sort of talking about not having enough diversity and this and that and blah blah blah. But the thing is, how many graduates, because obviously you have to have a specific educational background to be even considered for the position. how many graduates are coming out of those programs that are people of color? How many are there that are people of color? How can we, how can we sort of look at the roots of these issues in that regard? Because there are all kinds of barriers that don't just start with the institutions themselves. It is kind of this thing in society as a whole, which is my point, I guess.
Yeah, and then you ultimately have to ask the question, if racism is a justifying ideology, what is it justifying currently? Because I mean, the question of going back, we can answer, I think, a lot easier. But currently, what is racism as a justifying ideology justifying? Is it necessarily an entirely what's the word, tangible, like material thing, or is it the ramifications of a historical process? I would argue that it very much is that. Like, you put lots of people at a specific disadvantage, materially speaking, and you end up with, as Angie put it, an underclass, and you sort of need to have the ability to say, all right, well, our society functions. Our society, there's a reason for you to be emotionally invested in this status quo that you're going to defend, and you're going to deny the existence of these types of things. What are your thoughts on that sort of an aspect of it, ideologically speaking? What are your thoughts on sort of how this ideology is disseminated? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, you've actually kind of put it very, very nicely yourself. As listening to you kind of speak, I think the material aspect of racism is crucially important, and I can't help thinking about the response and methodologies people are now using to try and unpick or even manage those manifestations, as Angie mentioned. And it'd be good to get both your points in this, because one of the things I've observed is this, I wouldn't call it a new phenomenon, but it's a heightened methodology, which is anti-racist training, or unconscious bias training, or racial awareness training. And that is one of the more insidious things that we can explore in mass, institutionalized, a kind of genre of anti-racist work. And one of the things I thought about in this was that iconic image during the far right riots earlier on this summer of a black man carrying one of the racists out from being ambushed into safety into the arms of the police. Now that became the iconography for the weeks of that movement, of that moment. Now, thinking about that in the context of anti-racist training, there are a lot of people saying, well, maybe that person will kind of rethink or unthink his racism, given the fact it's now being saved by a black person from being lacerated. Now, for me, thinking about questions of social justice, I would rather kind of see that person in prison for his crimes and for his racism. Now, if in that period of time he begins to unthink or rethink his racism, obviously that's fantastic, but do it in prison. So there is, I think, a social justice question, to be cynical about, do we try to reform people's thinking around racism, or do we try and get justice in a way that is acceptable to black people, ethnic minorities, and their notions of safety? Because the ability to unthink or rethink racism, unconscious bias training, anti-racism training, is a very, very long and slow process, I would imagine. Whereas justice, on the other hand, should be a very, very rapid response within reason. And that was the two modalities that me and many others were grappling with in Alkmaar to respond to your kind of, I guess, broader question is, what is acceptable to people? They want a cutting edge of racism. Is it the idea of unconscious bias training and uplifting society en masse? Or is it the idea of overt and explicit justice, what is acceptable to kind of people? Of course, let's not assume a homogenous black population who think the same. My response may be different to Angie's and many other people as well. But there is something that I found particularly displeasing at some level about this idea of unconscious bias training being the solution to racism. Angie, thoughts?
I definitely agree. I think that I think it comes down again to material empowerment. Part of my problem with the unconscious bias training that's sort of in vogue among the corporate kind of world is the fact that there's something, you know, innately, you know, insidious about people who are in a position of power over you as a worker, rooting around in your psychology. There's a power imbalance there as, you know, the owner of capital, a member of the owning class, and somebody who works to create profit for them, then having their psychology rooted into by their boss. That kind of has a bit of a weirdness to it that makes me uncomfortable. And again, most of the time, it's about liability for the company. It's not necessarily about, you know, trying to improve society.
Yeah.
And secondly, the reason why I bring it back to material empowerment is, if I was materially empowered as a Black person, if I also had due recourse in my workplace, that wasn't just HR. HR is there to protect the company. It's not there to protect anybody. But if I had due recourse in my workplace, if I was materially empowered, you know, if I was able to have self-determination in that regard, then I wouldn't really care about what anyone's unconscious bias is anyway, because I'd be able to do my job and I'd be able to be materially empowered in that regard. That's their, you know, headache. That's their issues carrying. The fact of the matter is, the reason that they have their unconscious biases have impact is because of their institutional position of privilege, my lack of material empowerment, and my lack of due recourse. And I would rather address my lack of material empowerment than my lack of due recourse in the workplace than start rooting around in people's psychology. That's their business, and everybody has some form of unconscious bias. We live in a society that programs you to have some kind of unconscious bias. Even other Black people have unconscious bias. You know, I was talking to my grandmother about it recently. We were out in London and she crossed the street because a young Black man was walking past her. And, you know, she's Nigerian. She, you know, hears horror stories about England and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And even she has the unconscious bias as an elderly Black woman, because that was what she was taught growing up. Those are the images that she saw growing up. So I don't think that rooting around inside people's psychology is the answer. I think that dealing with the material issues that result and allow those unconscious biases to have any kind of power is what we should really be focusing on as the left. I think that corporate diversity training is incredibly pernicious, and I also think that it's something that ends up creating more problems and more division and hostility and more resentment among people who otherwise, as workers, have more in common with each other than they do with the owning class, which is why I kind of I find that kind of thing very, very pernicious.
I would say I have another thing to maybe ask about here. My thought is, I mean, the idea that, let's say, I mean, obviously, in the way that the system works right now, we can't really totally like topple the sort of the way that justice is applied. I mean, we can ask a question like, what is justice? What are we attempting to accomplish with justice? But my thought is, I'm a little bit inherently suspicious with trusting the law to sort of sort out anti-racism when the law is also kind of like the people who enforce the law currently are where, you know, the George Floyd type incident, like they're the instigators of that incident. They're repeatedly sort of in the driver's seat, so to speak, with this type of thing. And I do understand how if we were to take these types out of the general populace and perhaps imprison them, like I mean, that at least stops that person from doing it. But I'm curious as to how specifically that addresses it systemically, because the system itself, the police themselves are they're actors within they're moving parts. They're part of a whole. And if we're ultimately trusting the law, I'm curious, being that they're the enforcers of the law that are enacting the sort of atrocities that we're talking about here. I'm curious, how do we move forward from the perspective of, hey, we leverage the law against these people when they are in fact the people who are supposed to be enacting those laws.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I do share your trepidation with that as well. And I'm trying to think for a moment in a much more broader global anti-racist struggle than the North Atlantic project or the kind of UK projects as well, because laws, of course, are kind of bound up in notions of democracy, which mean different things, different regions, and different people.
Absolutely.
What is lawful in the States is obviously different in the UK, will be different in South Africa, will be different in other nations as well. So I do share that skepticism that we don't put too much faith in the very legal institutions that have for decades and decades and decades perpetuated the very racism we're critiquing.
Yeah, they're the actors. They're the people doing this, so to speak.
And that does create a conundrum, a problem for thinking about, again, a global anti-racist movement that has due regard for different understandings and conceptions of what is legal, what isn't, what is democracy, what isn't. That's a huge challenge, and I haven't got the answer to that. But as a
no one person is gonna. So,
but as a short response, and maybe a provocation for further discussion, both online and offline, is how does one sustain a question of a global racial justice agenda when, at some level, we need to kind of put our faith in a legal system that has done so much damage to us?
Yeah, that's what I'm really, I like, that's where I have a bit of a hang up on this idea, because observing these incidents repeat over, and I mean, we literally deal with, we see a media hype, at least for, and obviously it's not an entirely genuine media hype on account. They do a lot to minimize certain aspects of it. But we end up seeing this same cycle go over and over. And for me, I feel as though there needs to be some kind of large scale change that that is maybe not like, we need some form of, I think, populist movement oriented around this. And I would say that obviously BLM is a manifestation of that sentiment, but ultimately we're kind of seeing it defanged by, again, to go back to the media representations and the commodifications of anti-racism. They've the media has been managed to sort of redefine what BLM is in some respects, or perhaps create a sort of spectacular image of what BLM is, that they have a little bit more control over. They're more or less writing their own check here as to what these sentiments can ultimately lead to. It was abolish the police at the start. It turned into defund the police pretty quickly, I think, because the media characterized the idea of abolishing the police in a certain way. And I'm not necessarily saying that abolishing the police is possible or even something that necessarily everybody wants, but I mean, that's an instance of what is more or less a radical demand being, dumbed down into a more in-system, what's possible today or tomorrow type demand, which ultimately, like, in some respects may even not necessarily be helpful at all. If we defund the police, we create maybe a power vacuum instead of, addressing some form of systemic thing. And I ultimately, I think going around in circles in here a little bit, and I apologize for that. But I ultimately I find that when it does, like, to what extent are we, you know, signing our own death warrant by taking the same type of systemic, you know, putting our trust in the system, and to what extent are we bound to it? I guess that's I'm sure a balance that, you know, you're not one of us is going to be able to come up with, like, an actual, like, yeah, we'll do 60-40, or something like that. But yeah, that's my concern. Yeah, go ahead.
I definitely think that my major concern is how conversations about anti-racism now seem to be doing the job that racism once did, in the sense that it creates essential categories, it obfuscates the material conditions that Black people are currently facing. It also kind of creates an avenue for cross-class subjects to hijack the conversation in that regard. And it also justifies the poor material conditions that Black people are under by using symbolic kind of gestures to obfuscate the problem. I think that we need to radically think the way that anti-racism functions, the language around anti-racism, the demands of anti-racism. I think we also need to radically rethink the idea of a Black community in that regard, because we are all neoliberal atomized subjects. You know, back in the day, the Black community existed very much. There was the church, there were different activist organizations, there were, you know, all kinds of different places in the real kind of collective space where the Black community operated and was legitimate. But now, you know, we're now seeing the Black community being atomized by neoliberalism in the way that everybody is atomized by neoliberalism and by the neoliberal mode. And now when you think Black community, you're thinking digital spaces or characteristics that you have, arbitrary characteristics that you have in common with cross-class subjects a lot of the time. You know, Black Twitter being, you know, that kind of space, you know, Black celebrities and the sort of position that they occupy politically within this sort of Black consciousness. I think that there are a lot of things that we need to radically rethink in order for the goals of anti-racism and for the goals of, you know, general working class solidarity and people being lifted out of poverty and, you know, the goals of the left to manifest themselves. Because right now we're up against something incredibly formidable and something incredibly insidious that's kind of able to derail all of that kind of energy into what then ends up becoming something that atomizes us and something that kind of devolves into the logic of neoliberalism, which is market logic, the marketization of all aspects of life, signifiers, you know, spectacle, all of these different aspects kind of end up obfuscating some of the real material issues that Black people are facing. I mean, George Floyd, the reason that they, you know, pounced on him in the first place is because he wasn't like forging checks for $20. Who has to do that? Like poor people.
Yeah, exactly. It was a counterfeit $20 bill, I think he was trying to pass.
Yeah, the majority of the people who are picked on by police, the majority of the Black people who are assailed by the police, the majority of the Black people who have been killed and lost their lives are people who also were dealing with major economic deprivation, and that economic deprivation is then exploited through the racism that we suffer. Like, the places where you see the highest police presence in London, for instance, are usually in poor neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are low income. You won't go to Kensington and see police officers, you know, literally around the blocks. But I was in Kilburn yesterday, and there was a huge police presence. And yeah, Kilburn has a lot of Black people who live there, but it's also quite a multicultural, like, part of London. And the poverty is what leaves people vulnerable. The lack of economic access, the lack of access to decent quality of life is what leaves people vulnerable to these kinds of, attacks on their life and attacks on their humanity and attacks on their ability to thrive and be normal. And I feel like as the left, one of our primary objectives, I can't even believe I have to say this in 2020, but it kind of does seem as if the left has sort of lost its way a little bit. But our primary objective should be to empower people materially, and I feel like so much of that fervor for material empowerment, gets lost in the mire. I mean, there's no anti-racist movement of the past that believes that the goal of anti-racism could be achieved under capitalism. It's the reason why people like Martin Luther King were socialists. It's the reason why, there was a deep anti-capitalist sentiment within these movements, because the goals of anti-racism are deeply at odds with the goals of the current system as it exists right now. And I feel like a lot of what we're seeing is people trying to manage the problem of anti-racism within the current systemic paradigm. And that runs into a lot of tension and issues. And I feel like it's a conversation that's largely obfuscated because of this kind of rigidly constructed neoliberal identity politic that has kind of overridden the conversation about anti-racism within the quote-unquote Black community and in also other communities too. But yeah, I guess that's how I see it. We've been here for an hour now, so do we have any closing remarks? Is there anything that anyone wants to say in order to kind of close out the conversation and or to respond or anything?
Well, just very, very briefly. I think for me, as someone who studies the media, which kind of ties on both the points you're making, and I'll be brief, is this idea of the quantification of anti-racism and its manifestation in the media, and what I term cultural compensation. I'm thinking those two things are, or will, interact in very, very powerful ways to degrade what is possible for the anti-racist movement, and us thinking very skeptically about putting our faith, not just in the law, but even in the media, to be the response and solution to these problems. And obviously, of course, one manifestation is diversity, which you're kind of seeing more and more as a result. I think it's a time now where we really have to kind of push back against the fallacies, I think, that exist within that model or industry or genre, because those things for me are not indexed to a truly anti-racist praxis within the media.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Peter?
I more or less agree with that. Like, I think, I do think that there is definite need for more skepticism, particularly in areas on the left that, are sort of, I think there's a little bit too much acceptance from the media narratives that we're seeing. I think that the left has, you see X company say like, X slogan. I don't want to say any specific slogan because I don't want to imply that I'm against any of these slogans, but you end up getting a lot of people who just sort of accept that and like, yeah, we're doing this. We're along the lines of that. Like they're reusing images that they see there. And it's a skepticism in these institutions that ultimately, like, we do need to be putting forward. I very much agree with that. I think a skepticism in the law, a skepticism in the media, a skepticism in all of this. And I think, to Angie's points, the best things that we could be trying to do in order to unite people across these types of anti-racism movements is ultimately exactly what she's saying. What can we do to materially empower people of color, particularly people of color of working and poor class, and ultimately, like, those things actually do, they create cross-racial solidarity because they aren't necessarily just the interests of people of color. However, they disproportionately help people of color. So in some respects, I think that that's something that we could be doing a little bit more of as well, the solidarity aspects of it. I think that there's a lot in common with everything we've all been saying today. And I think obviously there's some areas I think that anybody is going to, find some difference, some disagreement, but ultimately skepticism, solidarity, that's the way to go.
I definitely agree that anti-racism is a universal fight. One of the areas that of tension for me has definitely been the way that the conversation has been like essentialized and racialized in a way that makes it seem as if it's only, a thing that affects those people, the racialized other, basically, over there. I definitely agree with your point that anti-racism is a universal struggle, and I feel like again, a lot of the movements of the past around that were centered around anti-racism understood racism, or at least grew to later on understand racism and anti-racism as a universal struggle. And I think the more people see that, the better it is, and the more it becomes less about racialized other, quote unquote, ally, the more kind of the more kind of energy that we will have around these causes.
Helping our fellow human beings is a good thing.
So any last words? Anything anyone want to say? All right.
That's everything I can think of.
Thank you guys in the audience very much for listening to this chat. I had a really great time. We've all had a really great time talking to you. Thank you for all of your comments. Sorry that we didn't have time to get to questions, but we hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Dr. Clive. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you, Peter, I guess, even though I'm going to see you later on anyway. And thank you to everyone in the audience. And thank you to the World Transformed for giving us the platform to have this discussion. Do visit the website, do make a donation if you're able to. That definitely helps out. Thank you very much, and we shall chat to you later. Goodbye. Bye.
View the full TWT 20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.